All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for venturing all the way over to the LSNA building from our usual meeting place over at the International Institute. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies. Very excited today to have gathered this panel of really impressive, interesting work by a great set of junior scholars who are doing work on this question of kind of what democracy requires and how one should deal with the Ancien regime in conditions of democratization, and drawing important distinctions between what it means to change the political regime and what it means to change the political elites who are regnant in that regime. And so we'll have 4 presentations. We have an audience online as well, so they'll be able to do Q&A as well. Let me just briefly introduce our 4 panelists who will be presenting in alphabetical order. So Killian Clarke is an assistant professor in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He received his PhD from Princeton University's Department of Politics. Much of his work focuses on the Middle East. He's currently working on a book, Return of Tyranny, which explains why some successful revolutions are reversed by counter-revolutions that restore the old regime to power. His work on counter-revolutions has also recently appeared in the American Political Science Review. Mohammad Ali Kadivar is an assistant professor of sociology and international studies at Boston College with a PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina. His research focuses on protest movements and has been published in the American Sociological Review and Comparative Political Studies. Last year, Princeton University Press published his first book, Popular Politics and the Path to Durable Democracy. Maria Snegovaya received her PhD from Columbia University. She is a senior fellow with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a postdoctoral fellow in Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. She studies democratic backsliding and autocratization in post-communist and post-Soviet Europe. Her research has appeared in journals including West European Politics, Party Politics, Journal of Democracy, and Post-Soviet Affairs. She has a book forthcoming soon with Oxford University Press. And Josef Woldense, I'm going to use the German pronunciation since you grew up in Germany. Josef is an assistant professor in the African American and African Studies Department and an affiliated faculty in political science at the University of Minnesota. He holds a PhD in political science from Indiana University. His research interests are in the areas of elite politics, authoritarian regimes, political institutions, and social network analysis with a geographical focus on Africa. He has published in journals including the American Political Science Review, Comparative Political Studies, Democratization, and Social Networks. So we've got an incredible range of expertise here today around, I think, some similar themes. It's going to be great to see the way that their research is going to speak to each other and to these debates. So Killian, you'll be up first.
All right, I'll begin. So hi, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. Big thanks to Dan for organizing this event and to Derek for helping us all be here together, and really excited to be in conversation with my 3 co-panelists. And thanks for those of you online and in the room for attending. So my talk today is based on my book project with Dan, which Dan recently mentioned. Sure. The book is called Return of Tyranny, How Counter-Revolutions Emerge and Succeed. And I'm going to be talking about one piece of the book which speaks directly to the themes and issues at stake in this panel related to democratization and the Ancien regime. Yeah, I'll say. No, it's okay. I have this. How's that? Better? Okay. Great. Okay. So just briefly on the book. So the goals of the book are twofold. I'm trying to develop a theory to explain why counter-revolutions emerge and succeed following successful revolutions. And then I'm evaluating that theory with a range of different evidence, including a global cross-national data set of counter-revolutions from 1900 to 2015, and then a focused case study of the Egyptian counter-revolution, which occurred in 2013, which uses a combination of interview data and protest data. Now, what do I mean by counter-revolution? I'm focusing on counter-revolutionary restorations, and that's why this book really does speak directly to the themes of the panel today, because I define a counter-revolution as an irregular effort in the aftermath of a successful revolution to restore a version of the Ancien regime. So I'm really interested in these dynamics where you have a revolutionary movement who has seized the government and taken power and is in the beginning of establishing a new regime of some kind. And then I'm interested in why these old regime elites who have been ousted from power, why in certain instances they're able to restore themselves in office. So that's really the main question of the book. Now, the book is a book about counter-revolution and revolution. So I'm not just looking at democratic revolutions in the book. I'm looking at a bunch of different types of revolutions. But I wanted to start off this talk with just one of the main empirical findings from the book. And this was also at the core of the American Political Science Review article that Dan mentioned. When I divide up revolutions in the data set that I built, and this is just one way of dividing them up into sort of three different types: democratic revolutions, leftist revolutions, and ethno-nationalist revolutions, what I find is that counter-revolutionary restorations are far more likely after democratic revolutions, right? So that's basically what this figure shows here. So of the 63 democratic revolutions that I'm looking at in the data set, about 30% of them are reversed by counter-revolutions. And the rates are really quite low for the other two types. And so what I want to focus on the talk today is kind of explaining that variation among these democratic revolutions. So when you have a democratic revolution, revolutionary government is in power, trying to establish a new democracy, why is it that you have this variation? Why is it that about 30% of them get reversed by the old regime, and the old regime comes back to power, and then 70% of them somehow manage to survive? That's the variation I'm trying to get at. So, I mean, 30% is higher than this rate for these other two, but it's still a relatively low number. So that's basically what I'm trying to make sense of here in the talk today, and in a portion of the book as well. I'm just going to briefly lay out some of the theoretical ideas that I use to unpack this in the book, and then I'm going to talk briefly about two cases that I look at in the book to bring this to life. So the book lays out what I call a governance trilemma that all revolutionary governments and all new democracies face when they first come to power. And the trilemma is based on essentially having to please three different constituencies in the immediate transition period. The first are the remnants of the old regime, these old regime elites that we're kind of concerned with today in this panel. There's always old regime elites hanging around during these transition periods. Even the most wrenching revolutions that I look at leave some of the old regime intact. So that's the first constituency. The second constituency are members of the initial revolutionary coalition. Now, coalitions, especially democratic revolutionary coalitions, are generally quite broad. And usually the revolutionary government that initially takes power, the kind of initial democratizing government is smaller than the revolutionary coalition itself. So you always have elites within this revolutionary coalition that aren't directly in the government and that still have a stake in the democratization process. So you have to figure out what to do with these revolutionary allies. And then you have a variety of popular forces in society, some of which may have backed the revolution, who have a range of different grievances and demands that they expect the new democracy to meet and to deal with. And the reason I call this a trilemma is that most new democracies do not have the capacity to meet the demands and concerns of all three of these groups. They usually have to choose, and they usually have to figure out who they're going to prioritize and who they're going to deprioritize. Now, the literature tells us that following pacted transitions or negotiated transitions or elite-led transitions, these are all largely synonymous terms in the literature, that new democracies should focus on the old regime and prioritize their interests. Why? Because the mode of democratization was forged through an elite pact, a pact between what are called these moderates in the old regime and moderates in the revolutionary coalition. This goes back to classic theories of democratization from folks like O'Donnell and Schmitter. The idea is that you basically have a pact between these two groups of moderates, and that pact becomes the basis for the new democratic government. And so the main goal during the transition is to ensure that the elites who have bought into the pact and forged the pact from the old regime do not renege on the pact, don't grow skittish, and essentially come to renege on the pact. So usually when this model is laid out, it's a coalition between old regime elites, the new democratic government, and sometimes these other allies in the revolutionary coalition. And usually the literature tells us that popular forces in society should be sort of deprioritized. Now, I argue in the book that this is not the right strategy following democratic revolutions. Why is it not the right strategy? Well, we have to think about the differences between these democratic revolutions and these more elite-led transitions. And there are two key differences that I point to in this book. The first is that in democratic revolutions, the old regime is not willingly ceding power through a pact, but is forced from power against their will. They are pushed out of power by a mass mobilization movement. And so in the transition period, they have a much stronger interest in returning to power than in these pacted transitions, because they haven't been able to negotiate the terms of their exit. They've been forced out of power. So they're going to have a very strong interest in returning to power. The second key difference is that democratizers in these revolutionary governments have a lot more leverage because they're able to lean on a mass movement that brought them to power in the first place. And so appeasing the old regime, kind of trying to mollify and kowtow to the old regime and form essentially a version of one of these pacts, is not the right strategy in these scenarios. It doesn't utilize the leverage of these revolutionary coalitions and this revolutionary base. And more importantly, these elites who have been forced from power against their will are going to be much harder to placate and mollify than in a more elite-led or negotiated transition. And so what happens when leaders in these democratic revolutions try to use this strategy is that generally they end up alienating or antagonizing popular forces in society and or allies in their revolutionary coalition. And then they end up seeing those two groups form some kind of an alliance with the old regime elites that they've been trying to mollify, so that essentially they get ousted by a coalition of all three of these actors. They end up totally on their own with nobody by their side. So I argue that in revolutionary transitions and democratic revolutions, a better strategy is to double down on the revolutionary base that brought them to power in the first place, to essentially prioritize elites in their coalition and popular forces in society, potentially at the expense of old regime elites. And while this does risk provoking a counter-revolutionary attack, a counter-revolutionary effort, there's also a means to rebut that effort, to push that effort back, because revolutionaries can fall back on their original revolutionary base, they can remobilize the initial revolutionary coalition, and they can essentially rerun the revolution in the face of a counter-revolutionary coup and stop these counter-revolutions from occurring. How am I doing on time? Okay, great. So I'm going to briefly bring this to light with two cases. And I'm happy to talk about other cases as well in the Q&A. The images that I've been flashing in front of you are largely drawn from Egypt, because this is the case that I've worked on the most. Egypt is a case in which a revolutionary government, a democratic government brought to power by a revolutionary movement, attempted a version of this old regime elite strategy. They attempted to bring the old regime close and to mollify and pacify them. This is what Mohammad Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was elected to office in 2012 after the democratic revolution in Egypt, this is the strategy that he pursued. Initially with a group of military officers called the SCAF, and then subsequently with the Minister of Defense Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood government did everything that they could to try to placate these officers. They gave them all of the concessions that they wanted in the constitution. They gave them all the control that they demanded over their budget. They carved out all kinds of special privileges for these elites. And in the process of doing so, Morsi and his allies, Morsi and his government, I should say, alienated the other half of the revolutionary coalition, the secularist half of the revolutionary coalition, who wanted to be included in the initial democratic government, but were pushed aside. And they also ignored popular movements in society who were demanding a range of different policies to meet the goals of the revolution. They entirely ignored these popular movements and decided to rule with a strategy of keeping their own narrow movement at the helm of government and buying off the military. And this strategy backfired with devastating ends. Both the secularist wing of the revolutionary coalition and popular forces in society turned on the Morsi government, and ultimately they formed an alliance with the military, who had never been bought off, who was never placated by Morsi's concessions. And they formed a counter-revolutionary movement that ousted Mohammad Morsi. And I see this dynamic occurring in counter-revolutions across the world and throughout history, including the list that I've just listed on the side of this slide here. And I can talk about these cases if you're interested, but there's a logic to this that recurs in these instances of failed democratization and counter-revolution. Now, just briefly, I'm contrasting what happened in Egypt to another episode of democratization that probably isn't as well known, although there may be some Latin Americans in the room. But it's a very telling episode. So Venezuela's 1958 democratization is a transition that looks in many ways like Egypt's. It's a broad, nonviolent, negative coalition of based revolutionary movement that brings to power initially a relatively weak democratic government that is overpowered and overshadowed by a military junta that's from the old regime. The key difference in this revolutionary transition is that 3 of the 4 parties, elite actors who were part of the revolutionary coalition, the 3 strongest, they form a pact, what was called the Pact de Punta Fijo. And that pact becomes a bulwark for the new democratic government against the military officers from the old regime. They also maintain their alliances to students and laborers within society who powered them who kind of fueled the revolutionary movement in the first place. And so when the military tries to come back to power, not once, but 6 times during the transition in Venezuela, there are 6 counter-revolutionary coups in Venezuela. They are all reversed by a version, essentially a rerunning of the revolution. The most powerful, the most dangerous of those coups is the first one, which happens in just months after the revolution initially succeeds in 1958. And what you see after this first coup, this initial coup, which is backed by most of the officers in the military junta, what you see is a universal condemnation by all the parties that were initially part of the revolution, and essentially a remobilization of society and mass protest. And that coup is stopped. And that's what didn't happen in Egypt. And that's the counterfactual that I think is relevant for the Egyptian case that could have happened had Morsi and his government ruled in a different way. And again, there's other examples of cases throughout history where you see this kind of remobilization of revolutionary coalitions in the face of counter-revolutionary coups that do in the end gird and stabilize these nascent democracies. So, does democracy require the toppling of the authoritarian old guard? That's the question posed for this panel today. My answer is that after democratic revolutions, the answer is usually yes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's an honor and pleasure for me to be here to speak about my research with you. So I also try to answer the main question for the panel, and I draw on the work I've done over last few years, my book and a few articles that I've written about issues of protest and democratization. So first thing I want to also ask is, what do we mean by democracy? There are, minimalist and maximalist, or formal and substantive definitions of democracy. By formal or minimalist, we mean minimum democratic institutions such as fair and free elections, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And then by maximalist definition, we mean definitions that concern participation of ordinary citizens beyond electoral processes. So I focus most of my talk on the minimalist definition, but at the end, I will also touch on substantive issues of democracy. So in my book, I argue that democracies that emerge out of prolonged episodes of unarmed mobilization are more durable and they grow more in their quality. This is because over the years of a struggle, the democracy movements are required to build organizations and put together coalitions that matter later for the transition period and for the era of post-transition new democracy. This argument is based on a statistical analysis of 112 democracies from 1960 and 2010, for each of which I quoted whether there was armed or unarmed mobilization and over how many calendar years the mobilization happened. And then I looked at 5 cases. So I will use my cases here to see whether the old regime was toppled or not. So the first case is South Africa, because it has had one of the longest campaigns for democracy in the 20th century. There was emergence of a major organization during the years of a struggle: African National Congress, South African Communist Party, COSATU, United Democratic Front was very influential in the 1980s. That was disbanded later, and these 3 have made the ruling coalition. The government, the party, the apartheid party is not ruling over South Africa since. So in this case, the old guard was toppled. We have had democracy, formal democracy, to this year. Another case similar to South Africa is Poland. Poland and South Africa are two of the paradigmatic cases of society-led democratization. Poland was not only an influential case, the intellectuals in the Polish movement also theorized the notion of civil society and contributed to the scholarly literature. In Poland, we also have emergence of the Solidarity movement in 1980, and it's in 1980-89 that we come to negotiations with the Communist Party. In this case, also, the Communist Party elite was pushed away from the institutions of power, and the Solidarity elite took over, and they were influential in basically institutional reform that led Poland towards democracy. Initially, the communist elite was only interested in having some sort of electoral authoritarian regime. That was their initial plan. What is interesting is that the first government of Poland was led by Lech Walesa. I think he was a great leader of the movement. He was not a great president. He created a lot of problems for Polish democracy. And what actually somehow saved Polish democracy was the return of the Communist Party. But it was not the same leaders. This was a reformed Communist Party with a new set of leadership. So this is also an interesting case here. Also looked at Pakistan. Pakistan have had a number of democratic intervals ruptured by military coups. And so in the book, I look at the episode between 1988 and 1999. So what happened in 88 was the dictator of Pakistan, General Zia-ul-Haq, died in an airplane crash, and the military leaders decided to hand the power to civilians. So Killian mentioned pacted transition. This was a pacted transition. The military negotiated the contours of the transition with the leader of the opposition, Benazir Bhutto, and they made sure to keep their privileges in Pakistani politics. So there are a number of security issues, such as the nuclear program and the dispute with India that military owns and claims monopoly over these issues. It doesn't really let the elected governments to intervene. So both Benazir Bhutto and then Nawaz Sharif, the two prime ministers of the time in Pakistan, tried to expand the power of the elected office of the prime minister, and it did not really work out. So in 1999, there was a dispute about the conflict with India, which led to the coup of Nawaz Sharif. So in this case, the old guard stayed in the institutions that they had, and then they kept the democracy weak. Neither Bhutto or Sharif finished a 4-year term. So it was just very recently that one Pakistani prime minister for the first time finished the four years term. And so the government was weak, and it collapsed also in 1999. So this is a case that I included. There was no popular mobilization. The old guard stayed in power, and there was a democratic collapse. Killian spoke about Egypt. In Egypt, there was popular pressure. There was popular mobilization, but it was a rather short episode. There was a lot of disagreement between the coalition, the negative call. They all agreed was that they opposed Mubarak. They did not have much agreement about what to do next, how to have a transition, what kind of government. And the old elite, basically the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, stayed in power, and they were the major institution that led the transition. The revolutionary coalitions, popular forces, made a coalition with the military elite in an illusion that the military elite would remove Muslim Brotherhood and hand the powers to them. The first part of their calculation was right. The second part was wrong. They removed and deposed Morsi, but they never gave the power back to them. Tunisia is the last case. In my book, the protest episode or revolutionary episode was also short, but arguably civil society forces were stronger. There's a very strong trade union in Tunisia, UGTT, and other organizations such as Syndicate of Lawyers. There are women organizations. And in Tunisia, the old guard was kicked out, and we got 10 years of democracy. There is no more democracy in Tunisia. Still, by Middle Eastern standards, This is an achievement. If you look at the WCED score for polyarchy given to Middle Eastern countries, still Tunisia has gained the highest electoral democracy scores in WCED, even higher. Turkey, for example, has had higher, more years of democracy, but never the quality that Tunisia has achieved. So these are cases I've looked at the book. I've also an article with two colleagues where we looked at democratic deepening, which is expansion of democratic participation beyond the electoral process. I think Brazil is an important case that we can learn a lot from. And what I want to highlight here is the Workers' Party, PT, which was a party that emerged during years of a struggle against the military dictatorship. It had connections with labor unions, and it took time for PT to come to power because the transition was completed in the late 1980s. And PT eventually came to power in early 2000. But the number of reforms that they initiated, first in the municipalities that they were controlling, contributed significantly in the expansion and deepening of Brazilian democracy. And it was, again, thanks to PT and Lula that Bolsonaro was kicked out and democracy was saved in Brazil. Okay, so what I argue is that for democracy to deepen, to survive, especially to deepen, to have quality, democracy needs organized collective actors with commitment to democracy. I think this is possible to emerge from top and bottom, and we see that it happened in Poland, but more likely for these actors to emerge from civil society. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. It's a big honor, as it's been said, to be here. My today's research certainly complements the existing scholarship. Is that, yeah, the presentation by other scholars focusing specifically on context of Russia, but also going beyond it. So, as it's been said by previous presenters, right, we know that the backgrounds of the elites do tend to influence their foreign policy behavior, values, and preferences. Since I'm coming here in this literature from the comparative background, I kind of feel the need to focus on this. In the context of Russia, however, most of the existing scholarship analyzing Putin's elites have focused on whether the security backgrounds, technocratic backgrounds, but very little scholarship actually focused on the questions of today's seminar, the continuity with the Ancien regime. This literature proliferated only early on following the transition, when, again, many studies focus on Poland as well. And in the Russian context, it generally has been showing that there was a remarkable degree of continuity. However, that tells us little about Putin's regime, and also we cannot really account of the re-autocratizing, say, dynamic within Russia by focusing on the 1990s alone. So from that perspective, I focus on that particular question and complement this research. Now, the interesting thing about the Soviet regime and the continuity of the Soviet elites in today's Russia is that during the Soviet times, the so-called nomenclatura refers to the lists of all administrative, managerial, remotely important political positions, which the Communist Party controlled and secured their appointments in these positions. So this group of people, as you can see on this slide, has been a really tiny minority, 1 to 3% of the population, including their families, according to estimates of scholars like Michael Vaslensky. So potentially exposing the fact that there is a degree of continuity of this really minor group in today's Russian elites is significant, given how small they were during the Soviet times. Now, in addition, the Soviet nomenclatura lived in a very different world from the one in which a Soviet citizen lived. As Woldense is one of the scholars who was the first one to study the Soviet elites. As he points out, a nomenclatural family member could have gone all the way from the maternity hospital to the grave without really ever interacting with real life experience of the Soviet citizens. Just to give you an example, right? Oh, this is just the empty bookshelves of the late Soviet Union grocery store. And next to me is the picture of the Berezka, a special grocery store only available for nomenclatura members. Certainly you can notice some differences there. And of course, being a member of nomenclatura was also in a lot of ways formative. The nomenclatura, first of all, was selected through a very strict number of mechanisms. So random outsiders had, it was difficult for them to get into this very privileged elite group. Later in the late Soviet Union, the status of nomenclatura membership has gradually become inherited, with more and more sons and daughters of nomenclatura members inheriting this status. In addition, there were a system of educational institutions which were, through a series of institutional educational mechanisms, ingrained in this membership, in the members of this group. So therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that this was the people with particular set of beliefs that might have been different from the rest of the society. Now, in this work, together with my co-author, we operationalize the membership in nomenclatura through two different ways. So first of all, we focus on the elites. The elites are analyzed through two different methods. Positional methods, a classical one, looking at the positions in the formal institutions of power, and a reputational method, which can arguably be more appropriate to Putin's Russia, where everything runs on a series of informal mechanisms. Here we relied on the list of top 100 most politically influential Russians in Putin's Russia. When it comes to nomenclatura operationalization, to understand who belonged to nomenclatura, we looked at people's career tracks in the late Soviet Union, and specifically at the top position achieved in the late Soviet Union, the value of 1 to those with the top levels of nomenclatura, and a value of 2 with those with middle to lower nomenclatura ranks. So what do we find out? First of all, let's take a look at the general data sets of Putin's elites. Here we look at 2010 and 2020 for a robustness check. One thing that jumps at you is like it's a heavily male group of elites. The other thing that jumps at you age-wise, these are all Putin's peers, which makes Putin's elites actually one of the oldest in the post-Soviet space. Most interestingly, of course, is the nomenclatura continuity. When it comes to the one, these are the very high-level folks, like the Politburo level. You'll notice there are a few of them. But then, of course, if we also add to that number those in the lower to middle ranks nomenclatura, the situation radically changes. And of the top 100 Putin's elites in 2010, you see that absolute domination of people from the group, which again in the Soviet times was only 2 to 3% of the Soviet population. In 2020, pretty much the same dynamic with small decline, understandable, age-related decline, mostly just because of the natural gradual replacement of these individuals due to the natural passing. Now, you can argue top 100 elites is not very instrumental because these are not the people who are really influencing decision-making in Russia. So we also look at the composition of security councils, which is the, you can argue, top decision-making body on most domestic and security issues. And again, the red line is the share of members with their careers in the Soviet nomenclature. You see that it's consistently high with some gradual decrease. And the interesting thing is this decline in 2008-12 due to Medvedev's short-term placeholding, which is miraculously still affected the composition, kind of speaks of the importance of rotation in power. This is Medvedev. Now, overall, the conclusion is that even the fact that it's been over a generation since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you still have a miraculously huge continuity of the Soviet nomenclature in Russian elite memberships, with some variation on average, about 60% or more. Now, how do we know whether it's a lot? As a reference group, we'll use the share of the Siloviki, individuals with the Siloviki backgrounds, and essentially use the classification often adopted by scholars in this literature. And Siloviki, sorry, I have to explain. These are the individuals with security service backgrounds, especially the KGB and other security services linked people. The Siloviki backgrounds, according to our codification, constitute about 30 to 40% of the elites, depending on the sample. Again, it's not nothing, and it's also somewhat comparable to the other studies that have shown something similar. Some differences may be due to the composition of the samples, but certainly way below what we find for nomenclature elites, with almost 60% of individuals belonging to this group. These groups overlapped only 30%, so essentially these are different groups, even if there's some overlap in there. Now, what does this all mean for the question that this seminar poses? Like, does democratization require toppling of the old guard, right? As you can see, my study does not directly answer this question, so since I'm not really focusing on causality here, but certainly a re-autocratization of Russia that's been observed since early 2000s probably is associated to the continuing domination of this Soviet elite in Russia's ruling class. As a matter of fact, some of the scholars who have studied 1990s Russia said that it was not so much democratization or consolidation of democracy as the revolt of the lower ranks of nomenclature, who in late Soviet Union found themselves without many social lifts, against the older top ranks. And once they were able to successfully remove the top of the Politburo, they successfully settled effectively to reproduce all the patterns of domination without bottom-up rotation and electoral accountability. That certainly was assisted by, after Putin came to power, and high oil prices made all of the democratic liberalizing concessions to society unnecessary. This is also consistent with a similar dynamic in other post-Soviet countries, where we see somewhat of a correlation that in the countries that older groups hold on to power, that you seem to have more autocratizing trends. Importantly, these groups are almost entirely devoid of legitimacy, so they're by default highly dependent on the political leader like Putin to be able to survive on top of power, and hence they are very much invested into this more autocratic rule of power. There's also a group of implications for policymaking. Because these nomenclature groups historically have been socialized into having high discipline and loyalty, it's possible they're not really Western-style elites, right? They're more Tsar's servants than their independent, noble kind of rivals of the king. And therefore, it may prove to be very hard to split them using sanctions, for example, as an instrument just because of who they are. They also see growing parallels between some features of Putin's regime and the Soviet regime in terms of, for example, cadre recruitment, which may have to do with survival of nomenclature. Last but not the least, and that's another kind of stream of my research, the survival of these groups with a particular worldviews on top of Russian power may be associated to current international assertiveness and the war in Ukraine, given a lot of these Soviet kind of beliefs about the world that they may have preserved, given, again, that they've been socialized at the peak of the Cold War. But last but not least, again, the causality remains an important problem here. It's possible that, as Vladimir Gedman, for example, pointed out when he read our paper, it's possible that the nomenclature presence on power is a consequence of autocratization. Maybe the narrowing of recruitment channels subsequently kind of led to disproportional survival of this particular group on top of Russian power. That's an important consideration about causality in terms of answering our question. But overall, I'll be grateful for any comments. I definitely continue this stream of analysis. Right now with Kirill, we're looking at the same elite compositions across the post-Soviet space. So hopefully in a couple of months, we'll be able to give you more convincing answers to the questions that we're asking here. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for being here and everyone virtually participating. Also, a little cart that's been going up and down. Sorry that you had to go through that. Maybe it's a conspiracy. Who knows? Anyways, so all right. So I don't have a presentation on a particular country. My work is actually more specifically on autocracies. I don't really do much on democracies, but I'll sort of use this as an opportunity to try to think through what does that mean, right? Especially in terms of my research, where I look at these elite coalitions and sort of on a fine-grained level as to who gets appointed where, right? Those kinds of questions. So with that said, let me just start in sort of ruminating around this question with what we're talking about here, right? So here we have, broadly speaking, the autocracy era, and then we have the democratic era, right? And the idea is that we have an autocracy that exists, it then gradually moves, and then there's this point of transition. At that point of transition, what do we see? It shapes sort of differs in some ways. And then the hope is that it will then proceed and continue that way, right? So the question that we're asking here is this sort of point of transition right here, right? That is, when we are moving from one shape to the other shape, is it necessary to get rid of whatever was in the back, right? The answer to that question is almost somewhat simple, but also not so simple. Do you have to get rid of the old guard or everything having to do with the past? No, you don't. You can absolutely salvage. What is it that you ought to be salvaging? We don't really know. Right? And it's a really, really complicated question. And I think the research today is making great progress on these questions, but I think we are, in my opinion at least, very much at the sort of early stages of really understanding what that linkage is between those two, right? So with that said, in sort of pondering this question, what I want to do is actually start with autocracy and sort of think through what is it that we mean by things changing when they do change, right? So with that in mind, let's start with the very first thing, and that is the ruler, right? In this case, think of this as more broadly the ruling coalition under autocracy. We got the ruler here, and then we got the population. And the question that we can ask when it comes to autocracy is just this fundamental question of, well, to what extent is the incumbent actually affording freedom to the population? And here, the answer isn't as straightforward, right? We do see autocracies where people do enjoy some freedoms, just not the ones about criticizing incumbents. Just don't do that. And we see in many instances that do have quite a lot of freedoms, right? Economic freedoms of sorts and so on and so forth. And that, by the way, matters. Now, the thing that we tend to see is that that's in some ways is mediated by the distribution of power between, if you will, the executive and these other institutions in the regime. So the legislature, the judiciary, right? Generally speaking, that the more we see some form of power sharing, the more we see this sort of de-investment of power away from the ruler, generally speaking, that sort of bodes well for the population. That we start to see some freedoms emerge out of that power sharing because the ruler can't sort of be arbitrary just onto themselves, right? Now, that's one thing. The other, and that's a big question, is the state apparatus. Okay. The question here is, do you or do you not invest into the state apparatus? Are you trying to build a functioning state apparatus? Right? And that sort of question is really a difficult one in terms of the sort of kinds of research that we're getting, is also, again, highly variable. We see some, Mobutu, who couldn't care less about the state apparatus, and it's falling apart. And then we see other instances where we see the exact opposite, right? Where we see actually quite sophisticated state apparatuses being built. There is, in fact, expertise that is being fostered, right? And that matters in part because ultimately it is the state apparatus that provides services to the population. Right? When we talk about is the bus on time, is your garbage being picked up, things of that nature requires a state apparatus that functions. Right? And you can go to autocracies where that very much is the case. Right? So That said, we can sort of, for the sake of our discussion here, sort of think about it just in terms of these two things, right? The freedoms granted to the population and the sort of services rendered to the population by way of the state apparatus. So that, in that sense, is, if you will, as I was saying, let's just think about that, about autocracy. So then the question becomes, okay, then what is it that's changing when we move to democracy? Right? I think that question is actually quite complicated. So what is the sort of fundamental thing we're saying, the essential feature that we're saying that is being changed here? Generally speaking, taking a minimalist approach, right, we can say there is now some form of multi-party elections. Right? And what is that doing? What is that doing to the system here? Well, for one, it is introducing uncertainty in the seat. Who gets to be in the seat is now at question. There's a risk that you can lose that position. Right? Now, that being said, and you just heard that with Killian's presentation, well, would the incumbent regime have any interest in entering into this weird thing where they may lose power? Why would you do that? Right? And our initial instinct may be to say, well, they will never do that, so always get rid of them. But our gracious host would disagree, that in fact, there are instances where the very autocrats are the ones who want to adopt democracy. And according to the research, it is precisely at the points when they're very confident that they will win, that they will say, you know what, that whole election stuff, I may even buy into it. I'll introduce that. Right? So there we would say, okay, there are possibilities for this, but then we see these counterexamples of what we're seeing today in Sudan. Right? And that, I think, in many ways speaks exactly to what you're addressing here, right? Where we have al-Bashir, who's overthrown by way of popular revolution, and these two figures who were his allies, right? And who since then have been able to sidestep the civilian side of this whole move away from al-Bashir's autocracy. And since then, now have plunged the country into all-out war. Right? So here we're seeing two individuals that I guess in sort of Slater's point of, and Rachel Riedel, you may say that the sort of conditions weren't met, in that they had, or in the sort of game of democracy, these two did not have the resources, they did not have a sort of popular mobilization to survive in a democratic context. So is it the case that perhaps those actors who would not succeed in the democratic game, are those the ones that you should be most cautious of? Are those the ones that you should sideline? Maybe. Right. Now, from there, we can ask the second question here, and that is, what about introducing elections and this distribution of power between the executive and these other institutions in the regime? What happens here? Now here from Ken Apollo, we have a really interesting study on Kenya, where actually you get exactly this. You get Arap Moi in Kenya, who was the autocrat, then remains in power when multi-party elections is introduced. And what Ken is able to what he finds here is that in fact, the legislature begins asserting itself, begins becoming essentially more autonomous, pushing back on Arap Moi, pushing back on his sort of tendency of sort of going it alone. Right? And so in that sense, we may say, well, there may be a possibility that elections can in fact create a more equitable form of power distribution, and that then hopefully leads back to the granting of more freedoms. Now, to what extent does that actually happen? It's not quite clear to me, in part because oftentimes elections come as a bundle. It's not just that you have multi-party elections, but it's also the fact that that comes with some civil rights and other human rights that are afforded to the population. So it's at times hard to disentangle what is doing what here, right? Now, the other thing to me that's more difficult is the state apparatus. And here, I mean something beyond just the sort of upper elites, right? The people who are actually staffing the state apparatus. What about them? And here we're getting some really interesting work. Monica Nalepa, working in the post-communist space, really addresses or really hones in on this question of what do you do with the state apparatus from the past, from the previous regime. And what I really appreciate about her work is that she puts front and center the cost of getting rid of the past. Here you are coming in, wanting to have a democracy, but again, you need to deliver stuff. You need to have a competent, functioning state apparatus. Getting rid of people, well, it may suit you in terms of publicity-wise, but then how do you deliver stuff? You can't, all right? So how do you even restaff? That's a huge question. It's a huge burden, all right? So in that sense, what Monica's pointing out is that, well, if you have technocrats, if you have people with expertise, you may want to be really, really careful about just sort of replacing them or getting rid of them, right? Because you are, by doing that, degrading the state apparatus. And then we have work by Hassan, a co-author on Sudan, and they have a really interesting piece on these folks, the civil servants, at this point of transition or this revolutionary moment, where they're trying to institute this change in the Ministry of Finance, which had essentially was a sort of bulk work, if you will, of al-Bashir's way of doing business, of sort of how he was sustaining the regime. And yet, those very sort of seemingly popular attempts at changing that policy, at that Ministry of Finance, ends up grinding to a halt, not by the elites, but by the civil servants. Why? Because it's not so much that they were sort of, having allegiance to the previous regime. It's just that then they don't want to lose their jobs. I've been working here, I'm making money, I like what I do, I like to continue doing what I do. And here you coming and you're telling me you're about to fire me. I don't like that. What am I going to do to prevent that from happening? And what they're chronicling is essentially civil servants who are now using these different coalition partners who are trying to make this change and have them essentially work against each other to halt this process. Right? So again, that complicates things here. And then lastly, for me, the question is, how confident are we that, right, the sort of, as I was just talking about, this redistribution of power, that we can have the population now has been granted the right to vote, that then puts pressure on these institutions in the regime, who then, by way of that pressure, are willing to invest in the state apparatus to improve it, which then provides the goods to the population. Because this is ultimately what you're being judged at. Right? You can have democracies, but if things are dysfunctional, you can have whoever it is come and say, this whole democracy stuff is nonsense. It doesn't do anything for you. Look at Germany, Weimar Republic, right? It's those kinds of, essentially, you see Trump is trying to take advantage of these kinds of things, right? So the challenge is, does this actually hold? Again, for me, the question is still waiting to be answered. So overall, again, sort of the simple answer is, can you salvage stuff from the old regime? Absolutely. But boy, do we know very little about what ought to be salvaged and how. That, I think, is a fundamental question that if anyone doing research, jump on the bandwagon, there's a lot to do. So thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. Those were terrific presentations and really spoke beautifully to each other. And you guys were incredibly, I would say, accommodating and trying to actually answer the questions they're asked in the abstract. Read the abstract, it was great. So lots on the table, lots of really, really fascinating materials. So I certainly welcome people in the Zoom audience to ask questions as well. But would anyone here present today like to take the first shot? Or I could put it more pleasantly than that, to offer the first insight or question for our panelists.
Hi, thank you so much. One of the questions that came to my mind, listening to both, all of the presentations, but in specific, Killian and Josef, where basically the idea of transitioning into a democracy from the perspective of the represented population, which means like democracy for whom? When the apparatus of the whole entire idea of the nation or that territorial could be colonial, for example, then will the democratization of the state normally results in decolonization of parts of the state itself? Or does that function on its own is a measurable or a sort of a measure to understand democracy without the actual functions that you described, like voting and representation? Because a lot of these democracies that we think of, they completely leave that aspect of decolonization outside of themselves, and that's sort of one of those examples for me is Iraq, for example, the kind of non-official no two-state solution that is still, I don't know if it's a democracy or it's not, in that aspect. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Oh, I think to me, yeah, if you can, I think to me, when we talk about democracy, that's what I was kind of trying to highlight here is there's a sort of scholarly approach about how do you even measure democracy? And sort of the minimalist approach of just like, okay, it's elections and that's what that is. That said, I think there's a lot of questions about to what extent do we think the main thing that distinguishes a democracy from autocracy, the main thing, to what extent do we think, now I highlighted that as elections, to what extent do we think that thing produces all the other outcomes that we would like to see, right? Be it anti-colonial, be it sort of broader distribution of wealth, whatever that may be, right? To what extent is it that we think the sort of core element of democracy actually produces those outcomes? And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. For me, I guess ultimately it comes down to what you get with democracy is the opportunity for change, the opportunity for grievances and challenges to be channeled through the state, and for those changes to come. But I want to stress the word opportunity, not de facto, sort of by default. Plenty of democracies we see are calcified with different kinds of elites who reproduce the same kinds of outcomes, despite there being elections. Right? So that's sort of where I would stand on this.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, it's a good question. I think it speaks to something Ali mentioned in his presentation about minimalist versus maximalist understandings of democracy. And, you know, is a democracy just a place where we have elections, or is it something with a kind of a deeper sense of social justice and equality? And many democracies in the world, including arguably this one, don't meet those kind of that higher bar, right? But what I would agree with what Josef said, which is that achieving that minimal level of democracy is sort of the first step, but you need to make that first step. You need to have elections and a sort of, basic electoral and democratic system in place in order to be able to take the further steps of achieving further social justice and decolonization and whatnot. And that takes time. I don't know of anyone who's looked at this systematically. Some of Ali's work actually looks at this a little bit, and there's a couple other scholars. But my sense is that these revolutionary democratic movements, these democratic revolutions, in many cases, are better positioned to achieve that fuller and deeper sense of democracy. I haven't looked at this question empirically, but looking at the cases, my sense is that is often true because they have kind of a mass base in place and they do a better job of clearing out the old elites who are more invested in these kind of old colonial or neo-colonial modalities and networks. And so that, there may be some hope there with those particular modes of transition, but many of them don't end up kind of meeting that bar. Many of them it's very difficult, right, to get rid of these deeply entrenched systems of power. And I agree with what you said about Iraq. Iraq is of course a weird case because it was a democracy imposed through foreign invasion and foreign intervention. But yeah, many countries strive to reach that higher level and fail to live up to that.
Great. Thanks for that. We do have one question online. So Natalia Forat, who is formerly a postdoc here and is now at Freedom House. And this question probably, Ali is probably best positioned to answer first, but I think for all of you. So Natalia says, based on your research, do you think civil society can do anything in advance of the often unpredictable transition to increase the chance of more stable democratization? I think the role of civil society more generally here and how it carries over for Ali or for others as well.
So yes, I think civil society can first provide pressure on the authoritarian government, the unarmed mobilization that I was talking about. It is launched and backed by civil society. And then during transition, civil society can, this is like the literature that exists about civil society tells us the functions of civil society. One is to articulate existing interests within society towards the political society. And I think one major thing civil society can do, and they don't always do, is to moderate demands. These are moments that not everyone is going to be happy, and we forget about that. So I think compromise and accommodation are important values during transitions that are often labeled as treason, and people who make compromises are labeled as traitors. This was very common during, for example, the Egyptian transition that we observed. Sometimes we even see it before the transition happens, even when people speak about negotiations. Tocqueville is one of the older theorists of civil society, and he talks about these values of cooperation, thinking of a bigger common goods. He's not the only Tocquevillian tradition is not the only tradition of civil society. There's the other tradition that emphasizes more on conflict, but I think that both are important. Conflict and accommodation are two faces of politics, especially in transitions. And I think one reason that there is different pieces of research that shows trade unions in historic episodes of democratization have played an influential role. I think one reason for it is that trade unions are familiar both with going on a strike and using contentious methods, but also negotiating with employers to get better wages. I think sometimes when youth movements or student movements or maybe some younger civil society organizations get involved in democratic transition or processes, they forget about the accommodation side. And sometimes when some of the old elite want to reform the process, they forget about the fact that there's also conflict involved, and they become very conflict avoidance in their approaches. Yeah.
I actually want to flag the contradiction in our work with our respected colleagues, and actually contradiction in findings about democratization across different regions. So a lot of the literature that's been pointed out here focuses on the coalitions and pacted transitions as a degree as a democratic success recipe. That is not the finding from the post-communist region. In the post-communist space, the success of democratization generally tends to be correlated with complete ousting or former elites from power. So if you look at Poland, for example, maybe Poland has best example of democratization recently, but certainly was such in 1990s and 2000s. The Baltics, most of the post-communist space, fewer former Soviet elites in power, more successful democratization. That is not how other colleagues have presented their results, right? It's not about pacts, it's actually the opposite of pacts. So from that perspective, to answer Natalia's question, it depends on the region, right? If you are a civil society in Poland, you actually want to get rid of the Soviet nomenclature folks, ideally. If you're somewhere elsewhere in Latin America, maybe you want a pact. But the real question is why such contradictions in findings? And this is something I'd call for our participants to engage. I think it's the most interesting question. So first of all, we might be looking at correlation, not causation. Everything that we've presented for you today is just it's a result of certain conditions on the ground in those societies. The fact that pacts were even possible in the first place probably speaks to you of certain conditions on the ground, right? You don't organize in pact with Ceausescu, who is like the murderous dictator and who was going to kill literally a lot of people in his society. Probably pacts are more likely, but again, correct me if I'm wrong, in countries with more established democratic tradition. Like maybe in countries like Latin America, where democracy was not something completely new and tried before, the elites themselves, even non-democratic elites, were more willing to negotiate with democratic opposition than what we have seen in case of, say, post-Soviet space, where the elites were brutal and unwilling to negotiate. It may also be a function of this strength of the civil society and other factors, but I just want to bring about this point that we're actually not showing the same. We're actually showing quite contradictory findings in our results, and therefore there's no one policy recommendation for the civil society.
Hi, thank you for the amazing presentations. I had actually one question, actually two, to Professor Clarke. So I see in your theory the kind of clash between the two forces, post-democratization, the old regime trying to return, and the revolutionary trying to keep their leverage on over the old regime. And I can actually think of many factors that can contribute to the size of each force's power, if you will, like I don't know, the size and the power of the military apparatus of the old regime, or I don't know, on the side of the revolutionaries could be the heterogeneity that caused the coordination problem of revolutionaries, so they might fail to like keep the cohesion of the revolutionary base. So I was wondering if like what factors that you were most interested in looking at when it comes to, you know, them affecting the size of each force, and like how that definitely just affects the dynamics between the two forces. And like my second question was like, how does the South Korean case fit into this framework? I think you're talking about the April Revolution, I think. So like in 1961, the April Revolution happened, and like after that, like actually that was 1960. Only after that, right. Park attended a military coup that was very successful, and I was wondering if you think, is it more on the revolutionary side that the counter-revolution became successful? So is it really because of the political instability of the revolutionaries? I was wondering like how you think about that.
Great, thanks. Both good questions. I'll tackle the first one first. So what contributes to this sort of relative power of each of the two actors is what you were interested in. It's a great question. And I mean, it a little bit speaks to what Maria was getting at in her recent comment about variation across different regions and different regime types, right? So who is the old regime is going to vary a lot depending on what type of regime has just been ousted, right? If you have a military dictatorship that's just been ousted, it's generally a powerful military that represents the most dangerous set of actors from the old regime. In the post-Soviet space, most of these regimes actually didn't have very powerful militaries, right? Because of the way that the Soviet military was structured and centralized. And so the most dangerous actors in those cases actually aren't military actors. They're more sort of corrupt clientelist networks and police forces, right? And security services. So each regime is different. And so the old regime actors in each case are different. So I do look at this in the book. And interestingly, the character of the old regime doesn't really predict much at all. It predicts whether a counter-revolution is likely to emerge. So military regimes and personalist dictatorships are much more likely to attempt to come back to power, but there's no statistically significant relationship with success, with counter-revolutionary success. And I think the reason is because there's a kind of similarity across all of these post-revolutionary transitions, a kind of fundamental balance of power, where because you've had a successful revolution in the first place, regardless of what the character or nature of the former regime is, you start off with an asymmetry. You start off with a set of elites who've been forced out of power against their will, who are sort of cowed and chastened and trying to fight their way back. And the revolutionary coalition starts off from a sort of ascendant position. And then you sort of, you press go and the transition, and these things can change, obviously, but the sort of the institutional character of the old regime really doesn't predict much in terms of the outcome. It's a little bit tough to sort of think about variables and measure the potential power of the revolutionary coalition, which was the other actor you were interested in. But I do look at a kind of a variety of different societal factors like polarization, strength of civil society, GDP per capita, all the sort of and there's really nothing that strongly predicts these outcomes. Again, because I think there's something about the nature of the revolution that sort of creates this strong coalition, regardless of what kind of society you have. And then the question is whether that coalition sustains itself or not. So, and then on the South Korea case, I mean, I'm not an expert on South Korea, and so I'm very hesitant to say much because, you know, you or Dan might just sort of slap me down. But my understanding of that case is that it has a lot of similar characteristics to Egypt. You have basically an old regime establishment that's not touched at all after 1960. There's no efforts to reform. In fact, most of the efforts were sort of to kind of placate the military. And then there's tremendous infighting and factionalization within the revolutionary coalition. There's lots of unrest in society. Basically, you know, the society sort of turns against the initial democratic government. And so everything kind of falls apart in the way that it did in Egypt. And it creates this kind of gap and opportunity for the military to come back to power. And that's in strong contrast to what happens in Korea in 1987, right, which Dan's written a lot about. The 1987 case, I think, doesn't look quite like the Venezuela case. There are some ways in which I think actually keeping the old regime close in that case actually did stabilize things, and we can talk more about that. But those are an interesting pair of comparisons. What happened in 1960 versus 87 in Korea.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would note is that there's an interesting, I think, kind of tension between the way Killian and Josef set these things up, in the sense that for Killian, a lot hinges on just that coalitional choice. So initially, you know, you prevail, and then do you ally with the old regime elites, or do you ally with the population, right? And so that it seems like almost a very kind of path dependent, you know, you kind of cross the river at that point, and things are decided. And in Josef's presentation, it was sort of more about, well, it really depends then on, well, are you going to invest in state building afterwards? Are you going to invest in, you know, provision of social services, this kind of thing? And in some ways, like it seems like in Joseph's presentation, it's as if the question of will democracy survive and will democracy provide good things is almost the same question. If it provides good things, then we can kind of expect it to survive. Those are kind of linked. Whereas in your presentation, it could be the case that, you know, well, it's just simply about you take out the military, and maybe you have a bunch of terrible outcomes and a very dysfunctional democracy, but you've killed off your main rival. And here I wanted to get back to Ali's case of South Africa, because on the one hand, we could say, well, South Africa, they certainly, you know, the National Party lost power. They weren't part of the coalition. But if you want to talk about the old guard in terms of the business class, and because one way to get the economy going again is you actually have to kind of make some kind of deal with the investment class, you know, if not necessarily with old conservative party elites. So I think that when we think about does it require toppling, you know, who gets toppled, and then to what end? And maybe there are sometimes they go together, but sometimes there'll be trade-offs between what's going to stabilize the regime as opposed to what's going to provide some better economic outcomes as well. So there's a lot of interesting points of different emphases across the talk, I thought. But yeah, right.
I was just going to respond and say, yeah, really, when we're talking about the Ancien regime, you do have to be specific about who you're talking about, right? You have the state apparatus, you have the business elite, you have the military, and you potentially have political elites and political party, and you might want to handle each of those four actors differently. It doesn't fit in nicely to a trilemma framework, because then you have like a 6-point star or something. That's what sociologists do.
So I have a question maybe on when an autocracy falls and you have this new regime, and for you, Killian, you were saying that for the democracy to survive, the new regime kind of has to clamp down on the Ancien regime. But I'm wondering, like, there's this dilemma in that the more you clamp down on the old regime, the more likely that you need to use autocratic means to actually reinvent the regime. So like I'm thinking about like Levitsky and Wade's recent book about like whether we think about Cuba or Iran or like these very revolutionary movements that completely overthrow the old regime, but then establish just new autocracies. So how would you answer this and fit it within the trilemma?
Book review.
Yeah, great question. So when when I'm talking about the sort of choices here, and prioritizing the revolutionary coalition and the base, I'm not talking about sort of mass purges and establishing autocracy. I'm really so these are mostly cases that don't have the option of doing what regimes do in Levitsky and Way's book, which is rule through violence. Regimes that come to power on the back of violent revolutions solve this trilemma in a very different way, which is they repress everyone, all 3 points. They don't have to worry about compromises or prioritizing people because they can use violence against all 3. And so they do that, and they establish largely autocracies, some of which end up being durable and some of which don't. Democratic revolutionaries don't have that option because they usually come to power on these nonviolent mass movements. And so they have this fundamental set of choices they have to make, and they have to figure out who to prioritize. But when I say prioritizing the coalition, the popular forces, they don't have the means to really establish autocracy and crack down on the old regime in the same way. So the old regime's still going to be there. I'm just talking about not prioritizing their interests and their preferences.
Thanks. This question's for Professor Ali, and it's about Pakistan case. And if I understood the conclusion directly, it's that the democratic reforms that followed General Zia's death were not durable, at least in part because they weren't demanded by a mass democratic movement. It made me think that there are cases in Pakistani history of mass movements demanding democracy. The movement for the restoration of democracy under General Zia, also perhaps more successfully the so-called lawyers' movement under Musharraf. But in all of these cases, I don't see much durable democratic change following. So I don't know. I just wonder how you think about these cases. I've always found it difficult to think about Pakistan longitudinally just because there's so much autocracy, there's so much military influence, direct or indirect. So how do you think about those cases? Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, so Pakistani democracy is very interesting because we have the partition, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and 3 different trajectories. So not to bring Bangladesh in. So from its origin, I think Pakistani democracy has a major problem because the whole idea of departition was that this Muslim landowners in the colonial India, they had privileges. So democratizing the whole country was not in their interest. So they supported to have their own country for all the Muslim people, and that's what all happened. So that's the origin, but then which is different from the origin in the Congress Party, which was more the educated Indian elite that led the democratization. So the movements made the difference from the origin. So coming to the examples you mentioned, in 1982, there was a campaign for restoration of democracy in in Pakistan, that was repressed. And what happened in 1988, it's hard to say that it's because of 1982. It didn't really provide much pressure that forces the military regime to make concessions. The lawyer movement also, it was a movement, but if we compare it with South Africa, for example, where there were years of a struggle, there were all these trade unions, there was United Democratic Front, both the length and breadth of these movements were not really comparable. But still, the lawyers movement made a difference in Pakistani politics. You are right that the old problems continue, but for the 1988-1999 period that I'm talking about, the military still had its privileges written into the constitution. As a result of the lawyer movement, at least formally, military lost those privileges. Informally, they have kept those privileges. And I think Pakistan needs a larger movement, a broader coalition. All different political actors need to come to consensus to push back the military. But we can see that when they did in the lawyers movement, they were able to push back for a little bit. And as I mentioned, for the first time in Pakistani history, elected government was able to finish a term. I mean, we can consider this not a big achievement comparing with other countries, but looking back in Pakistani politics, I think it's an achievement. The issue is that the path to democracy is long. There is no shortcut. And always when there are some moments when people think there is a shortcut, then it turns out there was not a shortcut. So it needs a lot of struggles and piece by piece, I think, reform and pushbacks in a case like Pakistan.
Sorry, my case is not about Pakistan, but we just were discussing this Killian on our way to this event, that it's actually also problematic to say, hey, people went out to the streets saying we want democracy. That means it's a large pro-democracy movement. And an example is Russia, which did have protests that associated to collapse of the Soviet system in late 80s and early 1990s. They were fairly large, and the word written on the posters was democracy. The problem is that so what? Yeah, where's the democracy in Russia now, and how does that correlate to this? The problem is that the way people understand democracy differs a lot in various contexts, and actually I happen to run a different study right now. First of all, it changes over time, and I'm not sure, unfortunately, there's no studies that studied exactly what Russians understood as democracy back in the early 1990s, but today it's often associated to a degree of economic well-being and state benefits, or at best elections. No free and fair elections, no liberal democracy as we understand it, right? And of course, all of that is also lacking, like in many of these countries, unfortunately, civil society also lacks any collective action experience that would have helped overcome other problems that emerge. So the fact that there's people in the streets saying that we want democracy, unfortunately, has very little to do with establishing liberal democracy as we know it in the West.
Okay, so I'm going to bring final question from our online audience, from Robertson Alphonse, and Robertson is asking about the doubts about democracy that arise. So at some point, if democracy is going to be toppled, it's because of some kinds of doubts that arise. So as we think now about democratic backsliding and mechanisms of democratic backsliding, rise of populism, how might that in some ways relate to any of these themes of what happens with the old guard? Is it about a lack of services and opportunities that arise after these transitions? How might we kind of bring that up to these current debates on backsliding, populism, and the like? Does anything jump to mind for anyone?
I mean, I just keep thinking about the complexity of this phenomenon that we're talking about. Is just, to me at least, it's mind-boggling in a sense of, and this is going to be a poor analogy, but any sort of people who whatever, like if you buy a new car, like making a new car in many ways is easier than fixing and repairing an old car, right? Or building a new house may be easier than fixing up an old house. In that, even I'm thinking here about studies of democracy. So if your classic studies, just ask the question, under what conditions do we see democracy arise? But the kinds of questions that we're dealing with in sort of the research that folks are doing here, it's about like, how can you have integration and yet sort of gradual separation happening? And that to me is just a really difficult question. And then you add on top of that populism, which quite frankly can emerge even absent sort of objective indicators of economic performance, right? And it's just a cop-out answer, but like, right, like these questions of populism and what populists are able to take advantage of, I mean, they're incredibly flexible in whatever grievance that they're going to be tapping into. And we see that, right? Like if you even look at these right-wing sort of parties in Western Europe, it's almost every 2-3 years, they will jump on a different bandwagon. If it's, right, like economic downturns, it's that. If it's immigration, it's that. Whatever that is, they can hop on and then try to sort of from there degrade the sort of whatever the democratic norms are. And one of the questions that sort of comes to mind for me is, how is it that even these populists, when they come to power, how do they then try to use their appointment powers to then actually infiltrate the different institutions to try to degrade them and gradually get them to wherever it is that they want them? These are all questions that, I mean, in part, I don't do that kind of research, but these are questions that to me seem to be central to that kind of question.
So yeah, I talk about this a little in the conclusion of my book. And it's sort of a sad conclusion in some ways, because what I say there, and actually this builds directly on Dan's work, is that sometimes the choices that these new democratic governments have to make to withstand the pressures of the old regime lead them to construct democracies that are not particularly responsive or competitive, and don't perform very well. So what happens in some of these cases is they end up, I talked about the pacts that end up being formed, not with old regime elites, but between these revolutionary groups. And what often happens in these countries is you end up with a sort of very little distance between these parties and very little competition. And so the governments, the democracies that emerge, end up being, I mean, what Dan has called these collusive democracies, right? They're engaged in promiscuous power sharing. There's basically no space. There's no competition between the different parties. And this goes on, and these pacts endure, and voters are seeing that their votes don't matter because the same decisions are being made regardless of who's in power. There's just a rotation of the chairs. And eventually they get disillusioned, and they turn towards populism. And this is actually the end of the story in Venezuela. Right. Venezuelan democracy lasts for a while, but the pact that's formed after 1958 endures. And eventually Venezuelans get sick of it and they turn to Hugo Chavez. This is also how the story ended in Tunisia. Tunisia is another good example of this. There was essentially no distance between the old regime party and El Nahda, the Islamist party. Economic situation in Tunisia was never approved. And eventually voters got sick of this and they turned to Kais Saied. And that's how you got a populist dictator returning to power. So there's a Goldilocks level of, needing to kind of come together against the old regime, but not wanting to come together so much that you end up forming a collusive pact and providing voters with no real choice, and unable to solve the basic problems that people care about.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about it is kind of a Goldilocks, balancing act. But another way to think about it would be to say, to come back to the theme of the panel, so one question is what you do with the old guard, but that's only one decision that a new democracy makes. And that there are a lot of other decisions, a lot of other policies they pursue that have really important implications. So that can, on the one hand, to Joseph's point, can seem kind of overwhelming. On the other hand, it means these new democracies have a lot of points of potential intervention, things that they can do, lots of lessons to possibly learn from more successful cases of how they were able to stabilize the ship, make sure that the population stayed invested, not run the economy off the rails entirely, have a responsive party system. And so there's lots you can do. And I think the empirical record suggests there are cases where you can get rid of the old guard, but then really blow it. You can keep the old guard and not blow it. You can kind of go either way. So it's one among many decisions. So lots of things to be researched. But this was really, I think, a great conversation. I want to give a very big thanks to Derek Groom for all he did to make this work logistically, especially in this new room. There was a lot of desperate moving around with microphones and the like. I was very impressed. But mostly want to thank our panelists, Killian, Clarke, Ali Kadivar, Maria Snegovaya, and Josef Woldense for being here today. So thanks so much for coming out for the session.